Welcome everyone to the For Nature webinars. We are so excited to have this webinar, which is the launch of the Practice Guidance for Protected and Conserved Area Finance. I am David Myers, the Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance and one of the lead authors of the document. And I'm going to be explaining the document to you, giving you a quick overview of it. But first, to kick off, I'd like to introduce Madhu Rao, who is the chair of the, I forgot, we're going to do a quick overview of the webinar. So we'll have some welcomes, and then I'll do an introduction to the good practice guidance, and then we'll have a panel that's moderated by Kathleen Fitzgerald, who is the project director of Enduring Earth at the Pew Charitable Trust, and with some great panelists, Jessica Smith, Hugo Van Zyl, Lucy Emerton, and Ross Dixon. And before all that, over to Madhu Rao, who's the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. Over to you, Madhu.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I'm really very pleased to be giving these opening remarks for this very exciting webinar. Marine protection, as we're all well aware, is an extremely high priority for the ambitious 30 by 30 target. There's an urgent need to not only strengthen existing marine protected areas and marine protected area systems, but to create new and effective MPAs at scale. However, a critical aspect of making MPAs, both new and old, functional and effective is the issue of financing. And never has it been more important than it is now to scale up financing mechanisms for marine protection. We are therefore very proud to share our latest contribution to the global conservation community, the Practice Guidance for Protected and Conserved Areas Finance, as part of IUCN's World Commission on Protected Area Good Practice Guidance series. So my heartfelt thanks to all the authors for their commitment toward this important product. The WCPA is hopeful that the guidance is adopted and used by the wider MPA community to improve the effectiveness of MPAs in delivering sustained conservation outcomes for nature and for people. Thank you very much, David, and wish you all a fantastic webinar.
Well, thank you, Madhu, and thank you enormously for your support for this process all along, and the support of all the colleagues at the World Commission on Protected Areas. So again, just a pleasure to work with you on this. So I'm going to just give a quick overview of the document here, and you can download the document at the IUCN website. If you just type in Good Practice Guidance for World Commission on Protected Areas, WCPA, you'll be able to find it. And here it is. And I'll start off by saying thank you to all of the authors. You can see the list of the authors here. We've also have a long list of fact sheet authors. I want to thank all the reviewers, the editors, the funding sources for this, the designers, of course, IUCN Publishing, and all of our colleagues at these organizations that support it. Again, thank you so much. It's been great working with you all, and very excited to have this out. I'm going to start with some key principles. This comes in the preface. We have these 8 key principles for protected and conserved area finance to think about and to touch on, no matter what stage of design or implementation of different finance mechanisms for protected and conserved areas. And that's to think about the diverse values of all the stakeholders and the diverse perceptions of all the different stakeholders involved. Money is obviously an important value, but it's not the only value, and nature provides enormous value for people and culture and economy. Take a rights-based approach where possible. Good governance, of course, is a key element to pretty much any finance mechanism. Strong institutions are essential and something to make sure that you're building as you design finance instruments. Think about how you can strengthen and work with strong institutions to achieve them. Take a systems approach. Use systems thinking whenever you can, because especially when it comes to finance and economics, there's interrelations among all different systems in the economy, but also, of course, ecological systems. Comprehensive collaboration is key to achieving a lot of these goals and to assuring that the approaches are effective. Take a portfolio approach. One finance solution is never enough for a single protected area or a protected area system. It's important to diversify your finance solutions and try to balance out large and small sources, and sources especially that you can retain. And then think about effectiveness throughout all your work. I'm just going to give a quick overview of all the chapters here and touch on a few insights from them. I'm not going to be systematic, but the chapter 1 is the case for protected and conserved areas. And we have Hugo and Lucy, who contributed heavily to that, who'll be in the panel. We have the foundations of protected and conserved area finance, which is more a theoretical chapter that can help guide you in thinking about finance for protected and conserved areas. In that chapter, we share these 4 practice guidelines, and please, read the document for much more detail on these. But first step is to optimize resource efficiencies. How can we be more effective with what we have at hand? And how can we choose the right actions to achieve our outcomes without needing to raise more money, for example? The second one is discourage harmful actions. How can we reduce the threats on these sites? Many ways that finance tools can be used to do that. And again, this will align long-term interests. You can use economic instruments. You can use a whole range of actions to reduce those threats. The third is incentivize positive actions. And here, think about who the key actors are that are aligned already with our conservation objectives. How can we support them? How can we use finance mechanisms to bring them in and align their long-term goals with ours? Like, for example, the tourism industry and sustainable agriculture, sustainable fisheries, things like that. And then finally, increase your financial capital for conservation. We know that there's not enough money for nature conservation across the board, but don't think about that as the only solution. It should be one of the approaches that are needed, but not sufficient for achieving our conservation outcomes. Another sort of insight here, and we're not the first to suggest this, but try to figure out what the greatest impact is at the lowest complexity or cost. Those would be your high priority outcomes. And maybe you'll choose some quick wins that are low complexity, low cost, and have a moderate impact. Long-term priorities could be large impact, more complex things like debt conversions or other types of instruments that require policy changes may have important impacts that you want to work many years on implementing, and then make sure that you don't spend too much time on these low priorities, which are highly complex and have minimal impact. Chapters 3, finance strategy and planning. Again, some good guidance on integrating finance planning into management planning. Chapter 4 starts the section that looks at different sectors, so public finance for protected and conserved area finance. And just a quick look at the finance planning structure here, looking at starting off with preparation and process, going to a situation analysis, finance objectives, developing that portfolio of finance solutions, think about how to present it in the form of a business plan or a finance plan, and then, of course, adaptive management as you go back to reviewing and updating your financial strategy. So again, much more information in the document. Chapter 5, international cooperation, donors and philanthropies. Chapter 6 is a look at site-based finance. And all of these later chapters have a kind of summary table at the end where we look at the 4 guidelines and we identify some of the key finance tools that are important to think about for each of those different sectors and sources of funding. So this is just an example from chapter 5. Finally, chapter 7, finance for Indigenous people and local Indigenous people conservation areas. Chapter 8, private sector finance, which is a good introduction to engaging the private sector in this. And then finally, we have 16 fact sheets that go into deeper dives on a range of different finance mechanisms. You can see all the finance mechanisms listed here. And on that, I'm excited to hand it over to Kathleen Fitzgerald, who will introduce the panel. And if you have questions that you'd like the panelists to answer, or any questions at all, please put them in the Q&A section. I see people are chatting in the chat, which is great. Introduce yourself. But if you do have questions you'd like us to address, please put them in the Q&A session. And Kathleen, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, David, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I think we have incredible representation from around the world. And obviously the number of people on the webinar really signify the keen interest in sustainable finance, and obviously the demand for sustainable finance, durable finance, as well as diversifying finance. And we've got the right group here to speak about this. So I'm really excited to introduce for the panelists. As David mentioned, these guidelines really were a collective community of contributors. And so I'm delighted to have Hugo Van Zyl, who is the Director of Independent Economic Researchers, Ross Dixon, who's the Development Director at Coast Funds, Jessica Smith, who's the Nature Lead at UNEP Finance Initiative, and Lucy Emerton, who's the Director of Conservation, Economics, and Finance for the Environment Management Group. All 4 of our panelists contributed to various sections of the report. And so I want to dive right in, and I'm going to start with you, Hugo. One of the core things that you point out with your co-authors in chapter 3 is the need for good financial planning as really a building block for unlocking sustainable finance, whatever the nature of that is. So can you speak to how protected area authorities, Hugo, are using financial planning? And then if I might also ask you to link that to, for example, entrance fees. Fact sheet number 1, you were co-lead on that. Can you talk about the financial planning and the link to that one sustainable finance mechanism? Thanks, Hugo.
Sure, thanks, Kathleen, and hi, everyone. I think there's just a growing awareness amongst managers they really need to substantially improve their finances more than ever. And that, the chances of achieving that are really greatly enhanced by explicitly integrating sustainable finance into overall management planning more and more. So it's kind of seeing a thicker, more nuanced layer of finance planning that is being undertaken, if you will. And that's supported by, as you said, a lot of organizations, Conservation Finance Alliance, IUCN, World Bank, several NGOs, projects like Biofin. So there's a lot of interest, which also, really assists. And I think that cuts across all the elements of finance planning, from the situation analysis to the finance needs assessment, and also looking at finance solutions. Maybe an example with finance needs assessments, they're just being required more and more frequently and from more sources. And managers have to respond to things like costing 30 by 30, massive expansion and a lot of work involved in understanding what it's all going to cost, which is part of the finance planning process. Funders want to know more about what it costs, things like project finance for permanence. If you're going to do one of those, as you will know, Kathleen, you really need to know how much this is going to cost to implement. So you're getting better benchmarking data for this coming in, which helps with finance needs assessment. So there's like a virtuous cycle going there. Even with marine, there's more and more work happening there, which which in the past was not so much. So it's getting easier, although there's a lot of variability. But having said all that, you still see a lot of general management plans that just don't have their activities costed. And that would be my main plea to the community out there, I suppose. Is too much of that is still essentially happening. If you've got a management plan with a bunch of activities, just go the extra mile and attach some cost to them, because then your finance needs assessment aspect is much enhanced. Yeah, when it comes to finance solutions or mechanisms, one can generally rely on seeing quite a lot of work on revenue generation still, as David pointed out. But now, there's more emphasis on cost efficiencies, budget allocations, and other aspects of finance, which is just as well, because you're getting finance ministries asking tricky questions around, what is the bang for buck that they're getting? Why, for example, is capital expenditure going down, but I see the staff expenditures going up, especially for headquarters staff? And can you explain that to me? So, these things have to be responded to by managers. Yeah, and then in terms of a concrete example, with Botswana, we did an entrance fee review because all the tourism fees hadn't been adjusted for about 19 years. So that ended up with a great success. We end up with more than doubling the revenue from those fees, and that all came out of a biofin project, essentially. So that amazing result. But the money's not retained. So I know a lot of managers face this challenge. And in addition, there wasn't enough reinvestment of the additional money generated. So you get this risk that you're not providing a return for the visitors and enhancing their experience. And there's a context of underfunding behind all of that. So, there's work to do, and there is now another project happening, which I'm involved in Botswana, to address these issues. But at least the increased revenue, or the more than doubling of revenue, it creates the opportunity to make other changes and to get a discussion going, showing that you're actually really achieving something. Yeah, so it leverages people's ear to listen to other initiatives. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Hugo. And there's a live discussion taking place in the chat. It's as if they read your fact sheet. Really important point, which Hugo just highlighted again, which is it's not just about increasing revenue, but it's about making sure that where that revenue is allocated actually supports conservation management. So thanks. There were a couple of people that flagged that as Hugo was speaking. And in the fact sheets, which Hugo's just referenced, and I think Ross is going to talk about one next, the fact sheets include information about the actual mechanism, a description, some examples, some trends, some best practices. So it's really trying to get some concrete examples and some guidance. So I hope you'll visit those. And I see that Sam has put in the link again to the report. Ross, over to you. Hugo mentioned project finance for permanence. It's as if we plan this. And in David's opening comments, he talked about system thinking, right? And obviously I'm biased. I can think of no better systems approach to planning and conservation finance than a PFP. You've been deeply involved with PFPs. So can you talk a little bit about your experience, as well as how Indigenous people and local communities can really use this mechanism? Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, for sure. And it's wonderful to see so many people from all over joining. So thank you for making the time. So yeah, what is project finance for permanence? Well, the report gives a great insight to that. And when I was thinking about this last night, I think it also really depends on which lens you apply. So essentially, it's a financial model that's now being used to support conservation at scale. And it has various elements really well described and laid out in the report. including the concept of a single clause. So a moment in time when all the core elements needed are agreed, and which really represents a shift from what we commonly see as a more incremental change in conservation. The PFP model in many cases always includes a conservation plan, and in many cases a community development plan, which is designed collaboratively and with clear outcomes, not just for conservation, but also for human well-being. They'll require commitments from Indigenous governments, regional and national governments, that are critical to ensuring that there's permanence to the conservation outcomes. That's really relevant when we think about 30 by 30, and also some permanence to the support for community interests. The model was pioneered in the Great Bear Rainforest in a conservation context, so the Pacific Northwest, and represented a shift from really a more outdated model of conservation to one that recognized, as Indigenous communities do and local communities do, that the health of people and place are inextricably linked. And this shift, certainly from my understanding of it, was really driven by Indigenous communities. Another key feature of the PFP is the focus on ensuring that at close, a financial model and funding commitments are in place from public and private sources. That's really a key feature. I think it goes back to what we were just hearing from Hugo on, and really a quite incredible level of detail required to justify that scale of investment. The permanence comes in as a PFP relies on durable and sustainable funding, which is achieved in various ways. It will likely require a conservation trust fund or similar body that's in place to manage and disperse those funds. So when Coast Funds was created, Coast Funds itself isn't the first PFP. It was a set of much more complex agreements around conservation of coastal temperate rainforest. It included ecosystem-based management, land use orders. And then the nations ensured that in addition to resources for stewardship of protected areas through 60 million from philanthropy, there was also support for community well-being, in this case 60 million in economic funds. For time, I think I'll just, like the Coast Funds website has a load of resources on the outcomes. They're pretty extensive, already over 1,400 jobs from the first PFP, over 23,000 days of training. And then from that 120 million, the original endowment is now sitting at about 100 million. And overall, with the economics funds, the nation's leveraged an additional $324 million. So something to consider about the model is the leverage. We didn't stop there. The Great Bear Sea was the last PFP to close in the region. And this time I'll take like a more of an Indigenous lens, or at least one from an Indigenous organization. And it was really about the vision of the nations and completing that vision, that they recognized that the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements weren't the end of the story, and they needed to also protect their marine resources, really restoring their role as stewards in a contemporary context. Some key things to think about. Really, this time around, the nations were at the driving seat in every aspect, and some of the outcomes were actually about reconciliation, which in some contexts can mean nothing and is a pretty loaded word, but in this context really does mean something, in that this PFP also came with a whole co-governance framework for what would be the largest network of marine protected areas in the world. So the nations really determined all of these aspects. They determined themselves to select Coast Funds, I think because they see themselves reflected in the governance model, which is really critical, that they really, I think, see Coast Funds as their organization. I'm looking at my notes and thinking what to drop out, and that's why I'm pausing. But you'll see all the elements in this current PFP. One thing that was different again is that the nations chose the allocation model. It's fairly complex to do with the size of the nations, the scale of conservation, the remoteness of communities. Last time that was somewhat of a black box held by NGOs, and that really wasn't the case this time around. The nations made all of the critical decisions. Maybe in closing, because I want to make sure there's time for everyone else, is what I would caution is maybe against thinking that there is a simple formula or model. There are key characteristics, and if the models are to be Indigenous or community-led, they really need that design and leadership to come from those places and those people. Ultimately, the best people to steward any place will be those people that will never leave. So as we consider using the PFP model elsewhere, it's really important to ensure that the leadership reflects those whose identity isn't separate from place, i.e. those who know that the health of people and place are inseparable. And so all the guidance and structure is in there in the report, but that's the piece I wanted to leave a bit of a lens for that, like really from an Indigenous perspective, this is about restoring with a financial model as one element, a cultural identity that's always been in place.
Thanks, Ross. That's fantastic, and really appreciate you highlighting that integrated nature of community leadership, Indigenous leadership with design, as well as implementation. And that's a common thread throughout the document. So thanks for highlighting that. And also Ross highlighted conservation trust funds as one piece of the project finance for permanence model, as well as, of course, other mechanisms. And there is a fact sheet on conservation trust funds if you're interested in CTFs, as we use the acronym for. I also see a number of people asking about presentations and only seeing our faces. We thought that given people were going to be flipping through the report, that it wasn't going to be prudent to use slides. So we don't have slides. Again, we just thought you would be looking through the report. So you're stuck with our faces. Jessica, I want to turn to you because in the report, you highlight the role that insurance can play in conservation finance. So can you speak to us about how insurance is used to leverage finance? And for those of you looking in the report, Jessica co-authored 2 fact sheets, 12 and 13, which focus on insurance. So over to you, Jessica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathleen. And I do have to apologize if anyone hears any background noise. I'm just moving in between events at London Climate Action Week. So I do apologize. And yes, at UNFFI, we have around 550 members from banking and insurance. And we also work with the investment sector. But actually, the insurance space is the one that we are most excited about in terms of the potential support to protected and conserved areas. So I'm very happy to highlight the 2 fact sheets that we worked on. The parametric insurance fact sheet gives an explanation of how index-linked or triggering products can be also aligned to the prevention of damage. And then human-wildlife conflict insurance also gives an event-based insurance product. So there are many growing numbers of examples of insurers who are innovating and bringing these to bear. And increasingly, I think we will see these applied to protected and conserved areas. And I also want to mention our colleagues at UNDP and Convex Insurance. Since this report was published, they've actually released a Jaguar habitat insurance, which actually covers both the insurance, the parametric insurance type, and it includes an element of human wildlife conflict insurance. So that's a great example to Google after this webinar. So we have 40 members of our Principles for Sustainable Insurance Nature Leadership Group. And we've put out over the last 3 years, a number of products which explain how insurers can contribute to the societal goal of nature positive. So there's certainly a lot that insurers can do around what they underwrite and to avoid driving damage to protected and conserved areas, for example, by ending finance that it's unnecessarily harmful to the climate. Also to ensure their entire portfolios are aligning with societal goals through all different sectors. Then also embedding nature-related risks into assessments of sovereign risk. That's a great strategy for mainstreaming. But I think those on the call and the topic of the 2 insurance fact sheets are around new products that the insurance industry can innovate and provide. And actually, one of the co-authors of the 2 fact sheets with me, Ria Kochar, she actually left our team to go to AXA Climate to work on the mangrove insurance product. So we're seeing very many great innovations coming out of AXA Climate, Howden, and others as well. And there's a lot of interest right now in the role that insurance can play in marine protected areas. And we do see, for example, for a very large extent of either a seascape or a landscape, insurance can be a key mechanism that you can then de-risk other types of investments. So stack capital on top of an insurance product. And this needs to be really unlocked at scale. And it can be for large ecosystems or large protected areas where you can find premium payers who have an incentive to protect that area and the ecosystem services that it provides. There's also a lot of opportunities in the marine space to start thinking about working with industries like offshore renewable energy, shipping, or ports, where there can be premium payers who then, fisheries sector as well, who have an interest to secure the marine protected area. So from Unipify, we don't see any limit to the possible innovation that we could see from the insurance sector. And we will continue to publish case studies like the 2 fact sheets to give as many examples as possible, and also to network insurers together so they can share what they've learned in this space. And we have a number of platforms where we are encouraging our members to contribute to the goals and targets of the GBF, especially Target 3. So we want to make sure that it's on their agenda and that there is a business opportunity there, particularly in the new product space, that's very exciting and a potential growth space. So I'll leave it there, Kathleen, but needless to say, the publication is not the endpoint for us. We will keep working with the insurance sector to move this space along as much as possible and make sure that sovereign states have the insurance tools that they need to de-risk protected areas and to underpin other types of funding and investment in protected and conserved areas.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jessica. And I'm really glad you mentioned de-risking, right? Because that's not just important in terms of the use of insurance for de-risking, but throughout the document, you'll see that risk is talked about in terms of a barrier, as well as mechanisms for how to de-risk so that you can crowd in other sorts of investment and finance. So thanks, Jessica, for raising that. And super exciting to hear about the jaguar insurance as well as mangrove. And I know there's a lot of interest in the human wildlife conflict insurance. There was a comment in the chat about case studies. And one thing I want to highlight is that in addition to the chapters and the fact sheet throughout the report, you will see case studies, which really try to lift up, again, real examples from the field of how these different mechanisms are used. So those are in the document. Lucy, I want to turn to you. Ross earlier talked about Indigenous people and local communities benefiting, engaging. Can you speak to, the title of this report is Protected and Conserved Areas, which I think in some people's mind is limited to government. But of course, we all know protected and conserved areas includes a suite of Indigenous conservation area, private, and for durability, communities need to be part of the solution. So Lucy, can you highlight how the report addresses this and some of your reflections on this important topic?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kathleen. And hi, everybody else around the world. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever, good day. Yeah, I can't take any credit for authoring Chapter 7, but I really do want to flag that it's so vital, that chapter on Indigenous peoples and local communities and finance for protected and conserved areas. And it's so often missing. I think we all really welcome the global interest in biodiversity finance. That's much needed. But let's just look at it. These magnificent debt for nature swaps, bonds, big ticket, big money, billions of dollars. Lovely, we need that. but I think we've still got some really serious gaps remaining. What about small scale? What about local? What about community finance models and mechanisms? And especially, because it's not the same thing, Indigenous peoples. Because this, you know, we all know we're never going to achieve our GBF targets or indeed our other conservation targets if we don't take it seriously. And finance is lagging behind. It's an imperfect world, but we've seen massive leap forwards in what we consider as protected and conserved areas, in governance, in laws, in legal recognition. But we've got a pitiful lack of mechanisms that are explicitly tailored to the community level financial situation and needs and capacities. Yes, people talk again and again about benefit sharing, about building local stewardship into their big ticket, big money, billions of dollars, global, internationally led programs. But if we're just trying to trickle down revenues and income that are generated by others and owned by others, I think we're missing the point. There's still so little devolution of financial authority. There's so little control or decision-making over finances and funding at the local level. There's a real absence of self-generated and own-controlled income, and all of that undermines the other steps forward, local autonomy, local sustainability. And so a lot of lip service to writing local communities and Indigenous people and small-scale enterprises into our big-ticket, globally led programmes, but where are the efforts to actually financially empower those people to generate and own and make decisions about their own funding? We are seeing some lovely examples, but these are the exception rather than rule. You know, we're seeing things emerging. I'd flag and give kudos to a lot of the work in Southeast Asia, both in the Coral Triangle and the Lower Mekong, which is looking at microtrust funds, which is handing over chunks of money to the local level to be invested locally and spent locally and decided locally, weaving conservation finance into microcredit, into women's savings and loan societies, some real global leadership stuff going on in Eastern and Southern Africa. Latin American Caribbean, we're seeing some really interesting incubators, accelerators and so on, which again are not just to do with trickling down money that somebody else owns and make decisions over, but actually empowering local level business people, entrepreneurs. And we're seeing some really interesting emerging ideas, just as we've seen a shift in paradigm in development finance, the idea of unconditional cash transfers, direct cash payments. We're seeing some pretty controversial and not quite thought through yet, but I think interesting calls for universal conservation basic income, where we stopped putting all this conditionality on the money we give communities and we just give direct cash transfers. I don't know if I agree with that or not, but I think it illustrates the shift in paradigm we need to see. So I guess to sum up, thank goodness for Chapter 7 in this Conservation Finance Practice Guidelines. I think that's a first. But a point it makes is we have to go much, much further. We can't just assume that all of this big ticket finance that the global community and the international organisations are so obsessed about at the moment will just sort of make community and local level and Indigenous peoples funding just happen. Or indeed that their finance needs and priorities just equate to cash trickling down from the heavens. I think we need an explicit focus on devolution of financial authority, on empowerment, on control, on self-determination, not just lip service into big global projects. And quite possibly we need a whole new paradigm that's not going to come from us, but is actually going to come from those local managers themselves. So that's my 2 cents worth.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lucy. And I hope everyone's flipping to chapter 7 right now. I see some comments in the chat about chapter 7 and agreeing with you. And so thanks for really highlighting not only the challenges that we have ahead, but just the real focus that it takes to make this work. There's a lot of great questions in the question and answer section. So again, just for all of you people that are new to Zoom, there's the chat section and then there's the Q&A section. David, I want to put you on the spot, if I might, because there's a question explicitly for you, which is how can PCA managers balance funder expectations for efficiency with the need for equity and long-term community outcomes on the ground?
Thanks, Kathleen, and thanks for that question. Really interesting one. So, efficiency does not necessarily mean holding back funding. Efficiency can be how do we work best with the local communities and Indigenous groups, for example, to achieve the conservation outcomes that we desire. And, so I'm always in favor of trying to understand how collaboration can work more effectively to achieve conservation outcomes, where everyone's perspective is coming from. And, our definition of finance is not just the flow of money, but it's the flow, in a way, it's thinking about value, thinking about incentives. And so, I think it's about communication, collaboration, understanding, and trying to find those shared solutions that move us towards our shared objectives.
Great, thanks, David. Jessica, there's a question there's lots of questions about insurance, but one I want to highlight is a question about how can we encourage industries to pay premiums for ensuring marine protected areas when ecosystem benefits are not yet valued?
Thanks. That's a great question. And I think we have a risk program at UNFI, and within this program, and we actually have, I didn't see this question, but we actually have a risk assessment guidance for insurers coming out on nature in, I think, 2 weeks' time. And effectively, once they have gone through, for example, a TNFD type assessment of their portfolios and understand the dependencies on nature of their long-term business, we do think that those values are now coming to light. So we are seeing more and more insurers interested in this space, realizing that it's essential and part of their business to be involved in this space. And as we see more case studies with insurance leaders, and I should also add Allianz and Aviva and Swiss Re to the list that I mentioned earlier, more and more insurers are understanding that, first of all, there is business to be done. Second of all, it protects their portfolio. And third of all, their business will be more resilient in the future. We cannot insure a dead planet. An insurance business has to be aligned with positive societal outcomes in everyone's interest. So we are seeing that message resonate more and more with insurers. And it is challenging when we talk about marine protected areas, particularly in areas beyond national jurisdiction or areas where these ecosystem services are dispersed and shared. But it is, the insurance industry is often, very large or very global, and you cannot insure away from these systemic risks. You need to be proactive and think about the large ecosystems and think about where the premium payers can align with the sectors that rely on the services that protected and conserved areas are providing. So I'm not saying that we have solved this by any means, but I do believe that insurers are on board for looking for these solutions, and they do see the benefit of aligning insurance products with positive outcomes for nature, especially if they are a large insurer and they are an insurer that hopes to be operational in 30 or 40 years. They need to be aligned with a nature positive future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jessica. Ross, there's a question for you. Just wondering, what have been the biggest challenges in aligning long-term funding commitments from both public and private sectors?
Yeah, I saw that question. I think for the two PFPs in the region I work, really the private sector investment is really philanthropic investment. I mean the private sector has put monies in through carbon sales, which we don't manage, but are part of the overall agreements. But for the Great Bear Sea, we're still working on a private sector mechanism to bring in resources. So I'd say that's a real challenge that really I don't think that in the PFPs that Coast Funds works on, there isn't really significant private sector investment outside of the carbon sales. It's public dollars and philanthropic dollars. And I think that's a real challenge. Logically, you would think that would be the case, but it's not. And even when you see the other resources that the nations that we work with draw in to support the work, I'm glad that everyone's flagging the fact that it needs to be diverse because it really does. I don't see a lot of private sector monies there, even though there is significant value to private sector industries. So I think that remains a challenge. I think what I would say about just to align in the commitments, really what's really worked well is a clear governance structure this time around that had the rights holders and nations represented and other partners, including philanthropy and government, sitting at different tables, right, in a really clear governance structure. So I think that's helped with that aspect of aligning commitments. But for the Great Bear Sea, that planning work has been going on for over 20 years, and really the PFP in this case for the Great Bear Sea was the financing mechanism that came right in at the end, which we're very grateful for, no doubt about it. But I think that that's still a piece. I know there's some good work in the report on that, but in the region I work in, it's still a nut to crack. I don't see a lot of private sector investment. We're now thinking, I think this Joe Reynolds is on here somewhere, thinking about social finance and outcome based models and things like that. But there's still a real challenge there in drawing in the private sector. But yeah, I'll pause there because it's a big question and I want to make space for others. And I'm happy to follow up with whoever Shahara who's asking that question, if that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Ross. David, did you want to reflect on attracting private sector finance at all, or Lucy?
Maybe Lucy. I do have thoughts, but go ahead, Lucy.
I think there's one thing I want to flag in my usual Lucy critical way, but I think this is the value of this kind of webinar with such a wealth of experience among the 286 participants and also the practice guidelines. We realise there are things we've got to do better. And I think one really important thing we have to, as the conservation community, attend to much more is this whole thing of bankability. That we still have very much a mentality of grants and public interest, which is vital, but we've still got a way to do in terms of, if we're serious about working with private sector, how do we actually, what is bankable, what isn't bankable, and not everything should or can be bankable. And again, we're seeing some great experiences coming out, particularly with the blended finance. David can speak to the Global Fund for Coral Reefs. There are many other examples of trying to sort of close the loop and find ways to bring what is essentially public interest goals into a more bankable project pipeline for private investment and return generating investment. So both an exciting development, a critical bit of the best practice guidelines, but definitely a remaining challenge that we haven't quite cracked yet.
Great, thanks, Lucy, appreciate that. I want to pivot over to Hugo. Hugo, there was a question about how can protected area managers best leverage financial successes to influence policy shifts and to unlock further investment, especially in the context of chronic underfunding.
No, thanks, Kathleen. I would say if you have these financial successes, let's say it's a public protected area network. If you have financial successes, then the leverage point is easier because you're approaching, say, a Treasury Department for additional funding, and they don't want to hear from you unless you can show some form of success and effort on your own. If you're not generating a bit of finance, then it's a bit of a tricky conversation to have with them. So I think that's the first point. But I would also say, and speaks to the previous points, there will be probably the majority of many protected areas are going to remain a public good type of situation, and you're just not going to be able to leverage finance from all of them. And you know, the data is very clear on that, that it's very difficult to do, and there are obviously circumstances where it's possible. But in that case, one has to then be able to leverage by making the more socioeconomic, wider values argument to decision makers that often still are, they're more aware of these things, but they're still, the awareness is very low around ecosystem services and other benefits, cultural benefits. They need to be made aware that, or reminded sometimes that, these investments are all aligned with numerous policy areas. They support numerous other departments generally, and that's more of a socioeconomic argument that you're trying to leverage, really, as opposed to, you know, a situation where you do have good finance opportunities. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Hugo. There was a question about funding considerations and how they might differ for OECMs versus protected areas. Did someone want to jump in on that question?
If no one jumps in, I'll take a crack at it. I think this is a really
Thanks,
important
David.
issue. We tried to, we thought about how do we address OECMs in the guidance. It turns out, the OECMs by definition, biodiversity conservation is their secondary objective, and their primary objective is so diverse that it was hard to kind of provide much guidance specifically for that. But just to point out that a lot of the OECMs do have other objectives as their principal goals, and those objectives can be revenue generating. For example, sustainable fisheries or even sustainable forestry, something like that that produces biodiversity positive outcomes as a secondary outcome. And so there's real opportunities for OECMs to think about revenue generating solutions as part of their finance portfolio, blending both return-based investments, which was a question that came up, before, with grants and other public support, other philanthropic support. So I think there's I'm looking forward to seeing a flourishing of ideas and finance around OECMs, along with the diversity of approaches that they provide.
Great. Thanks, David. There was a question about the role of co-management in finance and protected and conserved area management, which is a great. You knew I was going to hit that one. Obviously, co-management, there are so many ways that can be interpreted, but there is a fact sheet on what we refer to as collaborative management partnerships, which has been a very successful tool used in particular in Africa, where protected area authorities, they could be public, they could be private, they could be community, enter into a management agreement where essentially they devolve management rights to a partner organization. And across Africa, more than 19 governments have engaged in collaborative management partnerships. There are different types of collaborative management partnership. For example, delegated management is one of the three types that we define. And what we found is with delegated management partnerships, the revenue increases 14-fold across the continent. So thanks for flagging that question. It's being used across Africa. There's growing interest globally, and other countries are looking at the mechanism in Africa and trying to apply it. There's also reflections in the document about collaborative management, co-management with Indigenous people and local communities as well. So it's not just about that formal protected area management, but also gets into governance. And there are some examples in the document. So thank you for that question. I know we're running short on time. David, were there any other questions that you wanted to make sure we addressed?
I think we did a good job. There's maybe one more that came up at the end that I find intriguing for anyone to answer. What are some ways that funding or finance can be used not just to support conservation activities, but also to help change the systems or rules that allow harmful practices, especially in places managed by communities or Indigenous peoples? How can we use finance to change the system, change the rules? Lucy, do you want to take a go at that? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I lost myself, and I was very busy typing answer to the question on biodiversity credits. So maybe no, because my mind is full of biodiversity credits.
Okay, no worries, no worries. Well, then I'll just respond real quickly, and Kathleen, maybe you can close us out here. That finance, again, it's not just funding, but it is aligning interests in ways that ideally are long-term by influencing prices and influencing companies, and the disclosure rules that TNFD are encouraging, as well as soon to be compliance, and some of the innovations around biodiversity credits hopefully could also lead to some of these solutions. There's ways that we need to help the public sector, who are responsible for setting the rules for business and setting the rules for conservation, to understand how we can merge development and conservation in ways that are beneficial to everyone, that support the economy, that reduce risks, and that achieve the conservation and sustainability outcomes and equity outcomes that we are all seeking to achieve. So many, many ways to solve that problem, and we all need to work to find it.
Great, thanks, David. 3 minutes left. I want to ask each of the 4 panelists, lightning round, if there's one thing you want to flag for participants on this webinar. Maybe it's a case study, maybe it's a chapter, maybe it's a theme, maybe it's the color, whatever you want. I'm going to start with you, Jessica. Anything you want to highlight in closing?
Great. Well, chapter 8 is all about the potential role of private finance, and we are in a really publicly resource constrained environment right now in most countries. So I encourage everybody to keep an open mind on where the private finance sector can play a role, including supporting and affirming Indigenous rights. So the link to chapter 7 is quite important, as Lucy highlighted there. So there's a lot more that we can do together, and it just needs this spirit of collaboration. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Hugo?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just say when people are thinking about finance options, there can be an almost overwhelming number of options, but I would say get the basics right first, and get things in place and settle down, and review your fees regularly, and do these kinds of things first, or prioritize them before going into much more complicated and difficult mechanisms.
Thanks, Hugo. Ross?
I think it's like, to me, it's the case studies. I think so many things are conceptual and we need new ideas, and they're all valid, but you can learn so much, and especially we see this, especially in the Indigenous space, from your peers. Like, learn and look at what people have already done, and what they learned from that experience can be really valuable when we're really trying to make this happen. Beyond the concept, making it happen in the real world is really important. So I think I just underline the case studies that are in there, because they're real world examples, and there's likely others that you can follow up and learn from. And again, thanks for creating this space, because this is exactly that type of opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Ross. Lucy?
Yes. I think one of the very nice things about these guidelines, there are lots of nice things, is, presenting the bigger picture, conceptual framework, but actually leading the reader to guidance on so what, how do we do it? And I just want to flag to the participants, there are some nice further resources, particularly, I'll give an example. Chapter 3 is on finance planning, written by the eminent Dr. Van Zyl and others. One of the really nice things there is on page 38, where it takes those bigger picture principles and gives a list of practical guidance of if you're actually wanting to put together a finance plan for a protected or conserved area in different situations or biomes or circumstances, how do you actually do it? And often, again, that's something which is missing in this big picture guidance, is the specificities. And I see that coming throughout the best practice guidances, is how to actually do it.
Great. Thanks, Lucy. David, over to you to wrap us up. Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you, Kathleen. I want to thank all the panelists and all the writers and contributors to this amazing piece of work here. And I really hope it's useful to everyone. We look forward to getting feedback on it. I see Madhu has joined back. Madhu, again, thank you so much for your support. And it's been great working with the World Commission on Protected Areas on this. And yeah, thanks again. Don't hesitate to reach out and provide us with feedback, questions, and always happy to support.
Bye. Nice to see you.
Thanks everyone once again.